The tension was palpable from the moment Denzel Washington stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. What should have been a standard promotional appearance for his latest directorial project quickly devolved into one of the most uncomfortable interviews in recent television history. The atmosphere felt different from the start. Kimmel's usual jovial demeanor seemed forced, and Washington appeared noticeably reserved as he took his seat across from the late-night host. Kimmel opened, with what he likely thought was harmless banter, but his first question immediately set the wrong tone. "So, Denzel, you've been in Hollywood for what, 40 years now? Don't you think it's time to let some of the younger actors have a chance at the serious roles?" The audience laughed nervously, but Washington's expression remained stoic. There was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't in the mood for Kimmel's typical brand of humor. "I've earned my place in this industry through decades of hard work and dedication," Washington replied evenly, though his voice carried an edge that anyone paying attention would have noticed. "I don't think age should disqualify someone from pursuing their craft." But Kimmel, either oblivious to the warning signs or deliberately ignoring them, pressed forward with increasingly inappropriate questions. "Come on, you know what I mean. Hollywood's changing. There's a lot of talk about making room for fresh faces, especially from different backgrounds. Maybe it's time for the old guard to step aside gracefully?" The camera caught Washington's jaw tightening slightly. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "The old guard? Is that what you're calling accomplished actors who happen to be over 50? "Well, not just over 50, Kimmel said with a smirk that would soon prove to be a mistake. "I mean, let's be honest about the elephant in the room here. The industry's been dominated by certain perspectives for a long time. Don't you think it's time to diversify not just in front of the camera, but behind it too? Maybe step back from directing and let some fresh voices tell their stories?" The studio audience fell silent. Even they could sense that something was shifting in the conversation. Washington's publicist, sitting in the front row, looked visibly uncomfortable and was making subtle gestures toward the stage. But Washington's attention was entirely focused on Kimmel now. "Fresh voices," Washington repeated slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Are you suggesting that my voice, my perspective, my experience isn't fresh enough for today's audiences?" Kimmel, seemingly unable to read the room, doubled down. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time for you to focus on mentoring the next generation instead of competing with them. You know, be more of a behind-the-scenes guy. Let the young actors take the spotlight." "The young actors," Washington said, his voice now carrying unmistakable steel. "You mean the ones who haven't put in the decades of work, who haven't paid their dues, who haven't earned the respect I've earned through 40 years of excellence?" The audience was completely silent now. Even the usually chatty Kimmel seemed to realize he had ventured into dangerous territory. But instead of backing down, he made what would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. "Look, I'm not trying to be disrespectful here," Kimmel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But you have to admit, some of your recent choices have been questionable. That biblical movie you did a few years back? Pretty heavy-handed. With the religious themes. Maybe it's time to let directors who understand modern audiences take the reins." Washington's eyes flashed. "Questionable choices? Are you questioning my artistic integrity?" "I'm just saying that maybe your worldview is a little dated for today's Hollywood," Kimmel continued, apparently unable to stop himself from digging deeper. "The industry's moved beyond those old-school values you seem to hold on to." That was the moment everything changed. Washington slowly stood up from his chair, his full height and presence suddenly dominating the stage. The camera operators, sensing drama, zoomed in closer as Washington looked down at Kimmel with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and controlled fury. "Old-school values," Washington repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his theatrical training. "You mean values like respect, professionalism, and treating your guests with dignity?" Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Denzel, I think you're misunderstanding." "No," Washington cut him off, his voice rising for the first time. "I understand perfectly. You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work, but instead you've spent the last 10 minutes questioning my relevance, my artistic choices, and essentially telling me I should retire to make room for people you deem more worthy." The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras whirring. Washington took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence commanding every eye in the room. "Let me tell you something about old-school values," Washington continued, his voice gaining power with each word. "They include preparation, showing up on time, treating people with respect, and doing your homework before you interview someone. None of which you've demonstrated tonight." Kimmel's face was flushed now, beads of sweat visible on his forehead. "Denzel, I think we should take a break." "Oh, we're taking a break all right," Washington replied, but his tone suggested this was far from over. The studio lights seemed to dim as Washington's words hung in the air like a threat. Kimmel frantically gestured to his producers off stage, but Washington wasn't finished. He placed both hands on Kimmel's desk and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have delivered. "You want to talk about dated worldviews? Let's talk about yours. You sit behind this desk night after night, making jokes at other people's expense, thinking you're untouchable because you have a platform and a laugh track." Washington's eyes never left Kimmel's face. "But you know what you really are? You're a coward who hides behind humor when you want to tear people down." Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud or flee. This wasn't the scripted banter they were accustomed to. This was raw, unfiltered confrontation. "Denzel, please, let's just—" Kimmel stammered, but Washington cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. "Let's just what? Pretend this didn't happen? Sweep it under the rug like you probably do with every other mistake you make?" Washington straightened up to his full height again. "You invited me here to humiliate me, didn't you? You thought you could take down Denzel Washington on national television and get away with it." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Kimmel's face went pale, then flushed red. "That's not— I would never— Wouldn't you?" Washington's voice carried the full authority of his decades on stage and screen. "Then explain to me why every question you've asked has been designed to diminish my accomplishments, question my relevance, and suggest I should disappear from the industry I've helped build." Kimmel looked desperately toward his producers, but they seemed as paralyzed as everyone else in the studio. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming television history. "You talk about fresh voices and modern perspectives," Washington continued, his voice building like thunder before a storm. "But what you really mean is that you're uncomfortable with someone who won't play your games, who won't laugh at your inappropriate jokes, who won't pretend that disrespect is entertainment." "I respect you," Kimmel said weakly, finally finding his voice. "You're a legend." "Respect?" Washington's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You call this respect? You've spent the last 15 minutes telling me I'm too old, too out of touch, too irrelevant for modern Hollywood. You've questioned my artistic choices, mocked my values, and essentially told me to retire. That's your idea of respect?" The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this masterclass in righteous anger unfold before their eyes. Washington began to pace behind the guest chair, his movements controlled but predatory. "Let me tell you what real respect looks like," Washington said, his voice carrying the cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. "Real respect means doing your research before you invite someone onto your show. Real respect means asking thoughtful questions about their work, instead of attacking their character. Real respect means treating your guests like human beings instead of targets for your comedy." Kimmel wiped sweat from his forehead with a tissue that appeared from nowhere. I never meant to attack. But you did attack, Washington interrupted, pointing a finger directly at the host. You attacked my age, my experience, my worldview, my artistic choices, and my right to continue working in an industry where I've earned my place through excellence, not through making jokes at other people's expense. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell of this extraordinary moment. You know what the real problem is here? Washington asked, his voice dropping to its most dangerous level yet. You're threatened. You're threatened by someone who's accomplished more in their career than you ever will. Someone who's earned genuine respect instead of buying it with a TV show. Someone who has integrity you'll never understand. Kimmel's hands were shaking. Now, Denzel, I think you're overreacting. The word overreacting hung in the air like a lit fuse. Washington stopped pacing and turned to face Kimmel directly, his expression shifting from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. Overreacting? Washington's voice was deadly quiet. You think calling out your unprofessional, disrespectful behavior is overreacting? You think standing up for my dignity and the dignity of every guest who's ever sat in that chair is overreacting? He took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, and the host actually recoiled in his chair. Let me tell you what overreacting would look like, Washington said, his voice gaining power with each word. Overreacting would be telling your audience exactly what I think about hosts who use their platforms to bully and humiliate their guests. Overreacting would be walking out of here and making sure everyone in Hollywood knows exactly what kind of person you really are. Kimmel's face was now completely drained of color. Please, let's just— Please what? Washington demanded. Please pretend this didn't happen. Please laugh it off so you can go back to your comfortable little world where you never have to face the consequences of your actions. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Washington looked out at the audience, then back at Kimmel, his decision clearly made. You know what? I think I will take that break now. Washington turned away from Kimmel's desk and walked toward the edge of the stage, but then stopped abruptly. The entire studio held its breath as he slowly turned back around, his face a mask of controlled fury that had been building for the past 20 minutes. Actually, no, Washington said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm not going to take a break. I'm going to finish what you started. He strode back to center stage, commanding every eye in the room. Kimmel looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, but there was nowhere to hide from what was coming. You want to know about old-school values? Washington's voice resonated with the power that had made him one of the greatest actors of his generation. Let me educate you. Old-school values mean that when someone invites you into their home, you treat them with respect. When someone trusts you with their time and reputation, you honor that trust. When someone sits across from you as a guest, you act like a professional host, not a schoolyard bully. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a masterclass in dignity under fire. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Washington continued, his gaze never wavering from Kimmel's sweating face. Because your idea of entertainment is tearing people down. Your idea of comedy is making others feel small so you can feel big. Your idea of success is built on the humiliation of your guests. Kimmel finally found his voice, though it cracked, when he spoke. Denzel, I never intended— Intentions don't matter when the impact is clear. Washington cut him off with surgical precision. You intended to embarrass me tonight. You intended to make me look foolish, outdated, irrelevant. You probably thought it would be easy. Take down the old actor, get some viral moments, boost your ratings. Washington walked closer to the desk again, but this time his movements were controlled, purposeful, like a prosecutor approaching a hostile witness. But here's what you didn't count on, he said, his voice dropping to its most dangerous register. You didn't count on the fact that I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. You didn't count on the fact that I've faced down bigger bullies than you in rooms far more important than this one. And you certainly didn't count on the fact that I have nothing to lose by telling the truth. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the production crew had stopped moving, afraid to break the spell of this extraordinary moment. The truth is that you're a small man with a big platform, Washington continued relentlessly. The truth is that you hide behind your writers and your laugh track because you don't have the courage to face people as equals. The truth is that you've built your career on the backs of people better than you. And tonight, that ends. Kimmel's mouth moved soundlessly like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. Sweat was now visibly running down his face, and his hands were trembling as they gripped his desk. You asked me about making room for fresh voices, Washington said, his voice building to its climactic power. Well, here's a fresh voice for you. Your behavior tonight has been unprofessional, disrespectful, and beneath the dignity of this show, this network, and this industry. You owe me an apology. You owe your audience an apology. And you owe every guest who's ever sat in that chair an apology. The camera caught Kimmel's Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. I apologize, he whispered, barely audible. I can't hear you, Washington said coldly. I apologize, Kimmel said louder, his voice shaking. I was wrong. My questions were inappropriate and disrespectful. Washington stared at him for a long moment, letting the apology hang in the air. Then he nodded slowly, as if accepting but not forgiving. Thank you, he said simply. But an apology doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't take back the disrespect. It doesn't restore the trust you violated. He walked back to the guest chair and picked up his jacket, which he had placed on the armrest when he first sat down what felt like hours ago. Ladies and gentlemen, Washington addressed the audience directly, his voice returning to its warm, familiar tone. You came here tonight, expecting entertainment, and instead you witnessed something else entirely. You saw what happens when respect breaks down, when professionalism fails, when someone forgets that we're all human beings deserving of dignity. He slipped on his jacket with deliberate care, every movement watched by hundreds of eyes in the studio and millions more who would soon see this footage. I've spent 40 years in this industry building a reputation based on excellence, integrity, and respect for my craft and my colleagues, Washington continued, now addressing both the audience and the cameras. I won't let one person's poor judgment tarnish that legacy, and I won't pretend that what happened here tonight was acceptable. He turned to look at Kimmel one final time. The host sat slumped in his chair, looking smaller and more defeated than anyone had ever seen him. Mr. Kimmel, Washington said formally, I hope you learned something from this experience. I hope you remember that the people who sit in that chair are not props for your comedy or targets for your insecurities. They are human beings who deserve your respect. With that, Washington walked toward the edge of the stage. The audience began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. By the time he reached the steps leading off the stage, the entire studio was on its feet, giving him a standing ovation that would be remembered long after the controversy died down. Washington paused at the top of the steps and turned back one last time. He didn't look at Kimmel. Instead, he looked directly into the main camera. Respect isn't old school, he said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the studio's sound system. It's timeless. And with that, Denzel Washington walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a host, an audience, and an industry that would be talking about this night for years to come. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel sat in stunned silence, the weight of his mistakes finally settling over him like a shroud. The show would end early that night, and the fallout would begin immediately.